Welcome to the last talk of the semester for the colloquium on artificial intelligence, research and optimization. And today we invited Canca from the AI Ethic Labs, and she will give a talk about the PiE model, integrating ethical puzzle solving into AI research and development and deployment. And before she starts with her talk, I will lead a little bit of her bio, so you know a little bit more about her. And she's a philosopher and the founder and director of the AI Ethic Labs, where she leads the multidisciplinary teams of researchers to provide ethics analysis and guidance for the development and deployment of AI systems. She also serves as an ethics expert in various ethics advisory and editorial board. She has a PhD in philosophy, specializing in applied ethics. She primarily works on ethics of technology, having previously worked on ethics and health. Prior to the AI Ethics Lab, she was a lecturer at the University of Hong Kong and a researcher at the Harvard Law School, Harvard School of Public Health, Harvard Medical School, National University of Singapore, Osaka University, and the World Health Organization. So welcome, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. So today I will explain how we should think about ethics in practice, in particular in the practice of AI innovation, research, development, and deployment. So let me start off by, I've been using this graph for a while. I like using this because I think it sort of sets the tone. We talk about AI ethics recently, we've been talking about AI ethics as if it's been around for a long time, but actually we have started focusing on it quite recently. Having said that, there has always been philosophical work, computer science work that's been done in the area of machine ethics, robotics ethics, AI ethics, but this excitement and interest in AI ethics is quite recent. So this is the last 10 years of Google trends. So if you look at the Google search results, and you can try different versions of this search, so AI ethics, ethics of AI, and you will get some like a similar graph. As you see, the interest starts picking up after 2016, sort of mid 2017. So when we go closer to this graph, this is the past 5 years. The previous one was 10 years. You see that the 2017 starts picking up, and the reason being is because that's when the scandals started happening and around data ethics, around AI ethics, and the conversation came into the public spotlight, basically. One of these major scandals being Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. And you also see, I think I need to mention this spike in the graph because it's very eye-catching. So this is the April 2019. In 1 week, Google announced its ethics board. Trustworthy AI, European Union published its trustworthy AI guidelines. And in the same week, Google announced that it dissolved its ethics board. So that is also to say, you know, our guidelines have been, again, developed quite recently, and the practice of developing boards, developing processes has been quite recent and quite experimental. So I'm going to start with something quite basic. It does look basic, but I think it's important that we are on the same page when we talk about ethics. What are we really talking about? Ethics is the question that ethics is busy with is really trying to determine what is the right action to take, what is the right decision to make, and the just policy, fair policy to implement in any given situation. So we are trying to answer the question, what should we do? And we do this in an analytical, systematic, not subjective, and action guiding way. So the reason why I put these separately is because oftentimes ethics conversation is bundled together with things like just moral compass, each individual's own moral thoughts, and the existing behavior of societies, just looking at existing behavior of societies, companies, organizations, and just looking at codes, rather than asking this much more urgent question of what should we do? Not what is being done, but what should we do under a given sort of situation. So this is what we do in applied ethics, in the sense that in any we are given questions in variety of areas, in public health, in healthcare, in business, and we try to answer this question. So specifically when we come to AI ethics, we can lay out the scope of AI ethics by focusing on three aspects. One is the content and the product. What we try to do by asking this question that I showed previously is, how can we develop ethical technologies? That's one of our goals. The second one is about the process. How can we ensure that we employ ethical processes for technology development? And last one is implementation. How can we make sure that we are using and implementing technology ethically? Before I go to the next slide, which has an example, but I want to give another example that I that I've been using because I think it's a very easily illustrative example. So, for example, Facebook was trying. So one question that Facebook wanted to answer was, can the social media, can the posts of individuals in social media impact other people's mood? We know that there is from person to person in physical interaction, the mood is contagious, so our mood affects others, but does that also happen in social media? To answer this question, they did A/B testing. So they showed mostly positive, feeling positive posts to one group and mostly negative posts to another group. And after a week, they checked whether the behavior, the posting behavior of those individuals have shifted to what they have been shown. And yes, it was. So the question was answered affirmatively. We can, in social media, people also affect each other's moods. So the question that, like, when we look at it from the AI ethics, from the ethics website perspective, well, first of all, is this question, and of course, the question is curious because, well, the curiosity for this question comes from the fact that you can develop a lot of technologies and for a lot of purposes once you answer this question, depending on the answer of this question. So would those technologies be ethical? The easy answer to this is that, well, you know, it can, or it may or may not be, depending on how we really develop them and for what purposes. But in each instance, we will have more answers whether it is ethical or not to develop that technology. The second one will be, well, was this process itself, this A/B testing, was it ethical? And here it's really quite different from how, for example, you would do a psychology research in academia. So if this was an academic research, for example, there would have been requirements for making sure that the subjects are not harmed in the process. And if you imagine that some of these users might have been already in a very vulnerable state in their mental in their mental health, then we are talking about potentially harming individuals in quite drastic ways. And of course, in academic research, we would have a debriefing session as well afterwards. And finally, how do we implement this technology? So let's say that there is a technology that's being developed particularly for this purpose, for influencing each other's mood over digital sphere. How would we use it? So let's say we are using it in healthcare, how can we make sure that physicians are using it in ways that are ethically sound, ethically justifiable? So that sort of shows these three stages, aspects of the questions that AI ethics asks. Another example, more to the coming more to a question that we are actually working on in the field is predictive policing. So when we talk to the police chiefs, oftentimes what they are complaining about, what they are trying to deal with, is extremely high rates of violent crime and lack of resources in handling this situation. So what they are looking for from the technology is the promise of predicting where and when the crime will happen and who will commit it. Of course, this, what they are expecting is very forceful, let's say, in comparison to what the technology could provide, the probabilistic statistical approach, obviously. In building these, well, let me go back, but in order to answer this demand, both in academia and in private sector, there is a huge, a lot of effort in building these tools that for this particular purpose. And in doing that, of course, we face a number of ethical questions, starting with the first question being that should we even build technology for this purpose, but then going to the data question, what kind of biases might be in the data that we are using? If we are using models, existing models, what are we ethically allowed, ethically justified in using this model, and therefore the data that was initially collected for this model, presumably for a completely different purpose? Where is the consent question of those individuals whose data we are using, either, as I said, from the existing models, or from scraping the internet, or from cameras in locations that they are not explicitly giving consent to, and the risk assessment when we are getting these consents, but also when we are getting the consent. So how do we ask the individual, what can we tell the individuals in terms of the risk assessment, and also what is our understanding of the risk as we are building these tools. As the model, so this is about the data, but as we are building the model, we again face a variety of questions about which proxies to use, what kind of ethical errors can creep in through these proxies, the goal of the model, the explainability of the model, and so on. And finally, there's a question related to design of the tool in a very user interface sense. So what does the tool really say? What does it show? What is the dashboard? What kind of information does the dashboard provide? Does it provide indication of certainty? Does it provide the variables that it has been using? And connected to that, how can the user, in this case, the police chiefs or the public safety officers, how can they make use of this tool that is handed to them? How can we make sure that they are using it correctly, and they take the outcomes of whatever system that they are using in the most ethically justifiable manner? One question that we face, for example, in seeing these potential hotspots, what does it mean? Does that entail that the police should send the officers there to be ready? Or does it mean that they should send social workers, for example, to ensure that not more people go into the criminal justice system, but rather they are protected from engaging in criminal activity? All of this is extremely loaded. In the US context, all of this is, of course, also extremely racially loaded. And we cannot engage in any part of this question, in this innovation, in building a tool, without engaging in the ethical landscape of the question itself, including the existing questions, non-technology related questions in the criminal justice system, in the police safety, in the public safety system, and also ethical questions in the technology that we plan to use, if it is a risk assessment tool or if it is a facial recognition tool, the ethical questions that's embedded within that technology. So putting them together, the way that we should be dealing with these three areas of AI ethics is in two folds. One is figuring out in which ways we can make the design more ethical, which design interventions can we have, design and development interventions can we have from the very start in order to avoid unethical outcomes, unethical issues related to the research and development and deployment of the technology. And also understanding that not everything can be resolved by design features. Can we put in, for those questions that we cannot solve through design, what rules do we need to put in, either by the user, for the user, or for the developer, or for the system that it is going to be employed? So let's say the criminal justice system. How should these tools be used? So the area, the process that we need to cover in answering these ethical questions starts from the research and really goes through all stages of innovation. So the research, development, design, implementation, and even updating of the system as the system is being used extensively. And this includes, of course, questions related to data, questions related to algorithm, the tool, product, the practice, the human-computer interaction aspect. And I just listed some very common questions that we face regarding, as I mentioned, the algorithmic bias question, the consent question, the function creep question, the dual use question, etc., etc. So whatever ethics implementation that we are going to do, whatever integration of ethics we are going to do to this whole process, it has to really engage with all of these questions, and it has to be useful for answering these questions. Our current model of ethics in general, in practice, is this oversight and compliance model, which comes from research ethics. And especially those who do, those of you who are doing research in academia with human subjects must be very, very familiar with this, and not necessarily in a very favorable way. So the research ethics practice is, it appears in the very beginning of this whole process. So in the very beginning, before you start your research, you submit your protocol, research protocol, for ethics review and hopefully for the approval. This system, this oversight and compliance model. So the reason why I focus on this model particularly is because this really is the most developed ethics practice. We have boards, we have principles, we have regulation. There's a whole mechanism around it to make sure that it is a part of practice. Well, the question then is, well, is it the main question is this whole structure suitable for what we are trying to answer in AI ethics? So the research ethics model relies on boards, and particularly the board approval, and the board itself relies on principles, understanding and interpreting these principles. It is an authoritative structure. So if the board does not approve, you can appeal, but if the board still does not approve, that's pretty much the end of the ethics engagement, and probably the end of the research idea. The boards are quite distant from the researchers, and they might engage in some back and forth writing, asking questions, and some answers from the researchers, but not in a collaborative manner, just asking questions, clarifications, or demanding some amendments. And they are pre-approving research. And that's really where their engagement mostly is. They might do follow-up reviews depending on the type of the research. So the problem with this, well, first of all, there's an inherent problem that exists in research ethics in itself, this research ethics model in itself. Not necessarily about AI, but this model is very, it has many issues with respect to how to interpret principles, who is in the board, and of course the mismatch of different boards giving completely different answers because who is in the board, and the interpretation of principles really differ quite drastically. But that's a whole different conversation that we can have. But here my main focus is, whatever the weaknesses or strengths of this model, is this suitable for what we are discussing for AI ethics? And as I mentioned, it really covers this beginning, and it does not engage and cannot engage with all of these different stages of innovation because of its particular structure. A board that is checking and approving, so it has this, it definitely is very much slowing down the process, and it's a policing system for researchers. Instead, what we really need to have is a ethics implementation that starts from this first stage of building the idea, the research idea, the research design, research protocol, but then goes all the way until ensuring the ethical use of the technology. So for that, the model that I'm defending is the PiE model, puzzle solving in ethics. And let me also say that the puzzle solving in ethics here, what I mean is very much like bringing, instead of going the compliance route, going really back to the philosophy route, where we do engage in ethical questions, dilemmas, puzzles, and we search for solutions for them. This is really what we do in the domain, in the discipline, in philosophy, bringing it in that structure back to practice. So that's the idea of puzzle solving in ethics. So the core of this is the ethics analysis of the project or the product. The goal of this stage, this particular aspect, is to catch the ethics risks of the project, and also both in terms of the risks that the project is posing, but also understanding the risks that's already available, that's already plaguing the problem that we are trying to solve, and potentially turning them into opportunities. So an example that I give for that is, think about the AI systems that are looking at electronic patient health data and clustering them into patients like me or patients like mine. What it does is, in a way, what it does is to engage with an existing ethical problem, which is that we are saying that our medicine is evidence-based, and that evidence comes from clinical trials. But clinical trials mostly, overwhelmingly, exclude women and children because of ethical reasons, because children cannot consent, and women are largely excluded due to their potential pregnancy. So there's a huge age group that is often being excluded from the clinical trials. Systems that look for patients like me or patients like mine provide a solution for this particular ethical problem. The ethical problem being, well, as a woman or as a child, you are not really getting a proper evidence-based treatment. You are getting a sort of evidence, then it is, and then a chain of inferences finally, hopefully, applying to you in some shape or form. Whereas patients like me approach, or patients like mine, allow millions of electronic health records to be used as an evidence for which treatment is suitable for this particular type of patient, which can be a child or a woman. So in this ethics analysis stage, what we are focusing on is these particular parts of the potential ethics risks and ethics opportunities, as I said. So the first part is the project goal. Is this goal even ethically justified? Second one is to look at the landscape of ethics risks around the technology itself, as I said, and the domain itself. So the technology being, let's say, facial recognition, and the domain being public safety or criminal justice. Understanding and laying out those risks. Then as we move to the stage of development, we will face questions related to data, related to a model itself, related to the tool, the product, so the user interface, and throughout all of this stage, the research and development ethics itself. So how should we engage with research subjects? This will of course include most of the user experience as well. And finally, the stage where we hand over the technology to the user, and this is particularly important if we are handing it over to some systems to be used, like some organizations like the public safety, public health, etc. And the updating of the system. So there we are looking at the deployment risks. So these are the questions that should be answered by ethics experts in collaboration with developers, the scientists, the developers, the technology group, let's say, the team. Because we are not talking about, again, we are not talking about this oversight compliance model. So the idea here is not that the ethics expert will be like, yes, no, this is allowed, this is not allowed, but more like looking at how we can really make the technology stronger, how we can make sure that the data does not include ethical errors. The product is as inclusive as possible, that we are sensitive to the existing existing injustices in the system, and we find ways of mitigating those biases while we are building these tools. So it is a collaborative, dynamic, and agile way of working together. And you will also realize that this is sort of bringing together few things that we really actually know and talk about a lot. So it's definitely putting together ethical reasoning, because that's how we figure out what we should be doing. But it's also bringing together the design thinking in the way that how can we solve some of these ethical issues through design, as I mentioned. And finally, it's going towards decision making, but even policy decisions, in the sense that how should we treat questions like these, instead of acting as if we are seeing these questions for the first time each time. So going back to that particular point, how can we make sure that we don't start from scratch every single time? We come to the ethics strategy aspects of the model, and that is for organizational decision making. Here, the idea is, as we make decisions within an organization, which can be an academic unit, which can be perhaps more importantly, a company, how do we make sure that we keep an eye on ways to speed up the process and provide guidance for the next question? So understanding what value trades-off that we have engaged with is one aspect of it. Keeping a track of precedents, so the decisions that we have already made, and making sure that when we face a similar question, going back and checking that decision, hopefully for guidance, but perhaps to understand that we did make a mistake earlier, and revising our strategy accordingly is another one. And putting in place, in order to have these run smoothly, putting in place processes which might include boards, which might include a specific workflow, that depends on the type of the organization we are talking about, And finally, but actually first and foremost, having a type of organizational culture that allows these discussions, allows these discussions to go beyond chit chat and self-patting on the back, but rather asking them seriously with the mindset that we are going to take action. And so I talked about the analysis, and in order to make it in order to make it run smoother, this ethics strategy aspect. But of course, we want to make sure that not everything is done by ethics experts. Yes, there should be a collaboration, but there should also be ways that we can answer certain questions faster and reduce the amount of potential errors, potential problems. So to do that, we need those who are engaged in day-to-day developing and deployment of of the technology to be able to detect some of these ethical risks, solve the non-complex problems, but also flag the complex problems to get the expert help, so to speak. Again, you can sort of think of it in a similar way that like a legal. It will be much more resource friendly if those who are on the field can say when they are about to run into a legal problem and avoid it if easily doable. But if it is a complex legal problem, then call the legal team to get help, basically. So this is the ethics analysis strategy training, and the roadmap is the basic structure of our model. And the roadmap is really about what when we first see an organization or a team, making sure to identify what are their priorities, where should they put their resources first, and where should they take action first. Is there a product that we need to focus on immediately? Is there some strategy that's being built but not operationalized? Or is there trainings that they need that are clear and they already know what they would be focused on? So I'm just going to give some examples of some of these, under some of these topics, sections, some of the work that we do that is more interesting than just engaging with the day-to-day questions. So as I'm sure most of you know that there has been a proliferation of AI principles around the world. Companies, organizations, countries have published their AI principles. And so we put together an interactive tool where you can really just sort of make sense of this whole set of sea of AI principles. It's called the Dynamics of AI Principles, and this is our map in 2015. We had just we could find only 4 documents back then that's talking about AI principles, AI ethics principles. And this is our map in 2021, actually. We have over 100 sets of AI principles that are published around the world, concentrated in certain areas. Both from these publications come from private companies, corporations, from governments, from research organizations, from professional organizations, or intergovernmental organizations. So what we did is, so we initially put these out because we thought, well, if these companies in practice are publishing these documents, then there must be, first of all, they must mean something. What do they mean? And second, there must be a way of using them, making use of them. So we wanted to see what are the themes that what are the weights that they give to different ethical values. Since 1979, in biomedical ethics, we use 4 principles. In all healthcare, this is basically the 4 principles. And the 4 principles come from moral and political, philosophical theories. So we use those 4 principles: autonomy, respect for autonomy, individual autonomy, do no harm, do good, and justice. And we clustered all of these related principles under these core values. When we did that, this is also, by the way it mostly overlaps with the way that the EU's trustworthy AI framework works, which is pretty much the best one available out there among these documents. So using these 4 principles, they also add explicability, but they add it as an enabling principle. So it doesn't feature as a core principle, so it does not feature among our core principles either. So when we did that, I am not sure if I have I don't have the slide, but when we did that, we actually realized that there is no detectable difference between regions or between sectors in how much they care about, let's say, justice or the do no harm. They pretty much say more or less the same content, but with different instrumental principles, as we call them. So some of them emphasize privacy, some of them emphasize transparency, and so on. What we did is then to make it a tool where we can sort of use it as a starting point, as a checklist, to see, for example, if you want to think through the basic concerns, looking at those basic concerns through using these instrumental principles, transparency, explainability, privacy, and so on, the ones that are listed here, and doing that, understanding to what purpose they serve. So, for example, we don't value privacy for the sake of privacy. We value privacy mostly because that allows us to exercise our own control. It potentially protects us also from harm. So what we need to do is, if there is a question regarding the privacy, well, can we mitigate this using other instruments? Can we, for example, anonymize the data, even though maybe we are using private information, but when we anonymize, well, are we still violating anyone's privacy? In most cases, no, for example. So seeing these instruments and seeing to what purpose they serve. We developed this tool for basically for ourselves, for ethicists to be able to have a quick check and remember, make sure that we don't forget an aspect, but also for non-ethicists to go over their project or product and be able to see if there is a major problem or the problem is quite small. If there is a major problem, if we are somehow violating autonomy, for example, and we don't really have a way out without, let's say, violating justice, that's a big problem that requires in-depth ethics analysis. We cannot just like move on. We need to engage in proper in-depth analysis. So that's the purpose of this. So in some sense, this tool is meant to help the training aspect. So we use it in our trainings, but it also is meant to help analysis and actually also for the strategy, in the sense that if we are putting on AI principle documents as a company or as an organization, what do we really mean? When we say we protect privacy, but we don't mention, for example, protecting the vulnerable, do we mean really privacy for our company? Privacy is more important. If there is a trade-off, we are going to go with privacy rather than protecting the vulnerable. This can be a valid choice, but is this what the document means, or did we just not think about them and just put ethically good-looking concepts together? I also wrote an article about this in it's at the Communications of the ACM, basically explaining how we should think about these AI principles and how we should think about operationalizing these principles. Just, I think, one or two more slides. Another question that we've been dealing with was, human subject research protections, human subject protections for research, and how these protections apply in their current form to AI research. And there we have many questions with respect to informed consent, how it is normally practiced versus how can we meaningfully practice it in a online setting, in digital sphere. Questions related to risk assessment, minimization of harm, all of these well-known and commonly used concepts, how well do they translate to AI research? Like, spoiler alert, it does not, they don't necessarily. And where do we need to, which concepts, instruments we need to explain better, apply, understand better in order to deal with AI research. And this started off as our project. Then we prepared some modules for city program, and we are still working on our own side of it, because this is a question that is not fully answered. So when we are being asked guidance, advice, we are not yet able to answer them adequately. So we decided that this is something that we should do research on. I'm going to skip this one. Well, actually, let me just say one word about this. If you want to ask questions, we can go into that. This is a common objection that comes to a ethics practice in AI ethics. One question is, well, can we not just skip ethics and move on with human rights? Isn't it clearer? So I wrote to say, I wrote a piece that explains, no, we cannot. But for the reasons of time, I think I don't need to go into this. I'm happy to answer more questions about this in the questions and answers. And that's the lab. And there is more information about the PiE model on the lab's website. That's all.